this morning, and I'd like to welcome you, and also welcome those who will watch this later online. So this is a training session for Reach Madison, and I thought we could open up with a word of prayer. Father God, I just pray your blessing upon the work that you've laid on my heart and the heart of others to reach Madison with the love of Jesus. Lord, we pray that it would result in changed lives. We pray, Lord, that whole families would come to know you and serve you as Lord. And Lord, that the community would be encouraged to get involved in loving and helping one another, but also be encouraged to share the gospel with friends, family, and neighbors. Lord, this is so much bigger than we are, and we can't do this without you. And so we humbly seek your face in this, and we are just amazed at all that you have done and all that we look forward to you doing. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, my name is Judea Fox, the director of Reach Madison. And like I said, this is a training session for anybody who is either definitely on board or even somebody that's just interested, wants to know a little bit more of what it means to be a Reach Madison volunteer. And there's lots of different ways to volunteer, and we'll talk about those this morning. But to get us started, I'm going to ask Tricia Lewis to come up here and have Tricia introduce herself, maybe a little bit of a background. She's going to share with us some amazing tips for working with kids and classroom management. So, Tricia?
Okay, thank you. As he said, my name is Patricia Lewis, and I am a teacher. I've been a teacher for over 20 years. Maybe I don't want to say exactly how many years. Not always in the classroom, but always working with kids. So I want to go ahead and just share some tips and ideas for you. My goal for this session is that when we are done, you'll have some great ideas for helping keep things moving smoothly, and also when things don't go great, maybe getting back on track. So that's my goal. We're dividing this up into two parts. So the first part is basically how to prevent problems and to keep a positive environment. So I'm going to go ahead and start with, we have, the first thing that I want to talk about is structures that you can have in place that will help to have a positive environment and keep things positive and prevent problems. And the first one is to have rules. Usually you want to have just a few simple ones because they're easier to remember. And sometimes those will be specific to whatever you're working with, or sometimes they'll be for the whole organization. So that's something you want to be familiar with, and then make sure the kids are familiar with those too. Because if they know it, then they're going to know what's expected a little bit more. So I have some sample rules on the PowerPoint that we're going to go over in just a minute, and I'll kind of give you an example. But the basic idea is your rules should be so general that you can apply them to any situation that you're in, but specific enough that you can actually help the kids understand how it fits. So I have the rules behind me are ones, or beside if you're watching the recording, are ones that I've actually used in a classroom. And the idea is that anything that comes up, you can point to a rule and say, okay, how do we need to apply this rule in this situation? So your job then is more to make sure that the kids know what the rules are, for number one, and number two, to understand how to apply them well. So if you have something come up, say someone is not paying attention in class, which one of those sample rules would you point to help them get back on track? Yes, number two, because if you are ready to learn, then you're going to be paying attention. So what you do then is you just refer back to those rules. Those are the positive expectations. Really, the important part of those rules is to focus on what you want to see, what you want kids to do. You'll notice you don't have things like don't hurt people, because that's not the positive expectation. You have respect people. So they should be stated positively. I'm going to go over this again later a little bit, but you definitely want to focus on what you want to see, not the things you don't, because whatever you're focusing on is where people will go. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next one. The next thing that is helpful is having a schedule or a routine. I will go ahead and say if you don't have everything happening at the exact same time, that's not a deal breaker or a problem, but you should have some kind of regular things that happen so kids know what's coming. If you need to change it, which sometimes happens, then you're going to make sure they know that that's coming, and you're going to remind them. It sometimes helps, especially if you have kids who have trouble moving from one thing to another, or maybe don't like moving from one thing to another. They're having fun where they are, but it's time to move on. Give them a little reminder ahead of time, and then when it's time to do the transition, okay, now we need to do this. Those little reminders help them with that mindset. Another thing to keep in mind is always have something for them to do. Keep them moving, because kids who have a purpose, and this is, they tend not to act out or have problems. They don't create problems for you. The consistency is really, really helpful for kids. If they know what's coming, then they're less likely to act out because they don't know what to do next or what's going on. Again, this can be for the whole program, or it could be for whatever you're working with them on. Maybe if you start with a game, you go over the rules first, then you do a quick run through, and then you play the game. Whatever it is, just keep it consistent so they know this is what's expected. They don't come in and feel lost. That really helps kids to stay focused. And again, help them transition well. When it's time to move on to something different, give them a warning, help them do that, and remind them if things are changing. I'm going to go on to the third part, which is consequences. And so often when we hear consequences, we have this negative idea, but consequences is really just a simple way of saying cause and effect. So when you do something that is positive, then positive things happen. When you're kind to someone, you make a friend. When you are unkind, then often you don't make friends. So what you want to do is focus on the positive behavior as much as possible. That means if somebody does something well, maybe they shared with someone or were kind, then you make sure you point that out and say, hey, that's what we're looking for. Good job respecting people. And you can draw that back right back to those rules that I mentioned in the beginning too. If you can keep those things keep referring back to those, that will help you keep that positive environment and help them know what's expected. So do focus on the positive. Don't just think of consequences as they did something bad, so now I have to, give them a bad consequence. That's not the whole goal of that. The idea is when they do something well, then they experience the positive rewards for it, as well as, yes, if they do something they shouldn't be, then there's also negative. But again, right now I'm kind of focusing on the positive part, on how to prevent problems, and one of the ways is to make sure that they know what's expected and then reward it. Point it out, give them the attention that maybe they're looking for. Do try to be consistent in your expectations. If you want them to stay quiet, then keep them to stay quiet. If you want to change that, then you let them know that so that they know what's expected. Consistency really helps. It's not okay to hit somebody this day, then it's not okay to hit them the next day. Those kinds of things are pretty easy if you're with kids a lot. The other thing I want to point out is that yes, you need to be consistent in your expectations, but you also need to be, I use the term equitable in consequences. And I'm going to explain just a little bit what I mean by equitable. If you have kids who really, really struggle with, say, paying attention, and you notice that they were paying attention for half of the game today, it's okay to reward that kid and say, hey, you did a really great job paying attention, even though another one who maybe struggles to focus, who doesn't struggle to focus, maybe you just let them know, hey, you did a good job playing today at the end of the game. Sometimes when you know kids well and you know what they struggle with, they need the incremental positive reinforcement. And kids who don't have those difficulties can do well if you just give them positive feedback overall. So the idea is, where kids struggle, that's where you really focus on helping them, because that's what's going to be most effective in keeping the environment positive. Let's see. I had Oh, okay. I guess you probably can't read that based on the slide. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of behaviors, and I want you to think about what would be a way to give a consequence for the behavior. For example, the first one, Jemiah didn't have a pencil. Paul offered one of his. So what kind of consequence could you give for Paul? Any ideas?
Praise.
Yes, praise is a great one. Give him some praise. Say, hey, I saw how you shared with him. Here's another one. When Sarah was tagged out in kickball, then she kicked the girl who tagged her. What would be an appropriate consequence for that behavior?
Sit down for a while.
Okay, sit out for a while. Again, you can refer back. What was that? Discussion, sure. If maybe kids aren't real clear on what does it mean to respect people or what are the rules for the game, that would be a valid thing to do. Discuss it with them. Sometimes you can combine the two. Maybe pause the game for a minute because if tempers flared a little bit, pause it, have a quick discussion, and go back to it if everybody's able to discuss and be calm again. The last one, behavior is Marcus falls asleep every day. What kind of consequence is appropriate for a kid who's falling asleep every day?
You need to find out why.
Yeah, discussion on what's going on.
Okay, I love it because that's actually something I'm going to get into in just a little bit. But yes, find out why first. Instead of just saying, well, you're falling asleep and that's not appropriate, figure out why. Sometimes it might be that child actually just needs to be able to rest. Or maybe he's trying to avoid a confrontation with another kid, and that's a way of doing it. You find out why you can address the problem and work with it better. Excellent, thank you. So the next part of this positive and preventative interventions is competencies. So there are going to be, I believe, 3 competencies I want to talk about. The first one is leadership. So as someone who's a volunteer, you want to have good leadership qualities. And I put up a few Bible verses to kind of support where I'm coming from on these. This one is Matthew 23:11. The greatest among you will be your servant. And it kind of ties in with good leadership would be acting the same way you expect the kids to act. So if you have rules to be ready to learn, then be willing to be ready to learn too. If you want them to respect people, then you should show respect for others. And all of those things are things that you model first, because if you model them, then the kids have an idea of what they look like in this context. So modeling is really important. Another part is to make sure that you say things positively. And I mentioned this briefly before, but when you state your expectations, when you give instructions, you need to tell kids what they should do, not what they shouldn't do. And I'm going to give you a really simple example. Most of us here are drivers. And if you are driving at night and you can't see very clearly, one of the things that I remember from when I taught driver's ed a while ago is you tell kids who are learning to drive when you are driving at night and you can't see well, don't focus on the oncoming traffic. You need to focus on the white line at the edge of the road, because you are more likely to steer toward what you are focusing on. I'll connect that in just a second to the positive expectations, but if you are going to steer toward what you're looking at, what you're focusing on, then you want to make sure what you're focusing on is a safe place to go. You are much safer steering toward the edge of the road and following that white line than you are steering toward an oncoming vehicle. That's not safe. So in this sort of a similar way, if you state for the kids what you want to see, this is what I want you to do, then the kids will be focused on the positive expectations. If you tell them what they shouldn't do, then they're going to be thinking about the thing they shouldn't be doing. I can give you a really, really simple example. If kids tend to run from one place to another and you don't want them to run, then don't tell them no running, because again, you're focusing on that running thing. They're going to be thinking about running. If you tell them, let's walk quietly, then they're focused on the positive behavior you want. They're walking and quietly. So when you give instructions, I learned this as a parent. It's especially helpful with little kids, but I learned what works for 2-year-olds often works for teenagers. If you tell them what you want, they're more likely to do it. You can be a lot more complex with a teenager than you can with a 2-year-old. When I tell my 2-year-old, I want you to eat your food quietly, that's a little different than teaching manners to an older kid. But again, if you focus on those positives, that's going to help them know what is expected, not just what to avoid. The other thing I want to go over with leadership is that whole idea of role modeling. But when you're teaching them something new or practicing those transitions that I mentioned before, whatever, there's a really simple way to help them do it well. The first one is you tell them what they should do. Again, state it positively. The second one is model it. Practice it yourself. Show them how to do it. Then you have them practice it with you right there. And once they've managed to do that well, then you can expect, knowing that they've heard it, seen it, and tried it, then you can expect them to be able to do it. And that's a really simple way to get them to learn to do something new, even if it's just a good way to move from one game to another, move from one room to another, whatever it is. You want them to pick it up and put it away. You show them how to do it first. Tell them about it, show them, have them do it, and then practice. The one other thing I want to add here in this leadership one is you may be the only Jesus they experience. Some kids don't have that in their lives. So remember how Jesus interacted with people and try to do the same thing too. The next one, and this goes right along with what I just said about being Jesus to them, is relationship. The verse I picked for this is 1 John 4:11. Since God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. And the important thing about relationship is that they need to know you care, or they're going to struggle with the rules. I had a pastor whose motto as a father was that rules without relationship results in rebellion. And I heard that when I was young, and it's kind of stuck, and I've really tried to include that, not just in my own family, but even in my teaching. What I discovered is when you have a relationship with kids, they react a lot better to those, even when there's pretty strict expectations, high expectations. So ways to develop the relationship, since that's so important, to talk to them, find out what interests them, and ask about it. I know that not everyone loves video games, but that tends to be a big one for some kids. Maybe what they're reading, their pets, their hobbies. Find out what they're interested in and listen to them talk about it. If you can ask them a question that indicates that you understand a little bit, that often gets bonus points too. But listening is a big one. Another thing that's sometimes helpful is just a little physical touch. And I want to go ahead and caveat that. Make sure that they have the opportunity to say no, they don't want that if they don't, because some kids are really not comfortable with it. But most are totally fine with, say, a fist bump, a pat on the back, stuff like that. Some people I've even seen develop whole fancy handshakes with each different kid. I've seen another example is a teacher at the school where I work has a nickname for every student. And she gets to know them a little bit, and then she gives them a unique nickname, and that's how she refers to them the whole time. It works for her. Figure out how to relate to the kids well, what kind of relationship you can have, and that's really important. The next one that I'm going to talk about, the next competency is cultural awareness. When you work with kids, you will discover that not all families are the same, not all values are the same. And it's kind of important to have that relationship with them, not to be too judgmental about things that are different. A good way to handle it when you have different expectations than maybe they're accustomed to is to simply, again, state positively, here, this is what we do. Without saying it's wrong to do it some other way, it's simply here, this is what we do. State those positive expectations, model them, show them how it's done, and then that should help with those helping them to learn the culture that you are creating here. So you should identify and model the values of the ministry. And then some of the things are more obvious than others, but I'm going to go ahead and read the verse, 1 Corinthians 9:22. Here's why I say that we should do this. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And the idea is, if you can understand what their family values, their family practices are, then you may be able to understand better how to relate to them again. Some values are more obvious than others. Some of them are more black and white, as in they are positive, negative, and simply just different. You can see them pretty obviously. One way to handle different values, I'm going to give it a really simple example. In some families, the value of standing up for yourself is really important. So if somebody says something to you, the family value would be to punch that kid in the nose. Well, I have a hunch that's not what you want to see in a setting like Reach Madison, because you want kids to be kind to each other, which means that not only is that insult not appropriate, but neither is the response. So a way to do that is simply address both of those. Hey, we need to be respectful of each other here. If he doesn't want to be called that name, don't call him that name. And nobody likes to be punched. Without necessarily saying it's wrong to punch him because he said that to you. Just focus on here's how we are here. The other part is to talk about kids. Talk to kids. How did that make you feel? When he called you that name, how did that feel? What's a better way to handle those feelings? You can ask them questions like that. Maybe even focus on what's a better way to handle them here. Finally, there are some tricky ones, tricky values that are not obvious and not easy to identify. I'm going to tell you two of them. Do they have the handout with them now? Okay, so two of them were listed on your handout. One of them is taking turns talking versus interrupting. In some families, if you have something to say, you just speak up and say it. In other families, there's an expectation that you let somebody finish talking, or you say, hey, can I talk next? That's very different, and it's going to feel really different if you have two kids from two different environments who are trying to interact with each other, and one of them is interrupting, and the other one thinks that's really rude. That's where you can simply set up the expectation. Hey, here, let's make sure we take turns. Or if you want to talk, why don't you let him know instead of just jumping in? Again, focus on what you want them to do. And then the other one is indirect versus direct communication. Because some people, and it's even in the same families at times, but often it's a familial thing where one family will communicate more directly and another will be more indirect. So for some people, to ask a direct question, would you do this for me, feels disrespectful. They are more likely to say, I think I would enjoy playing this game. What do you think? And that's basically an invitation. Hey, will you play this game with me? But not everybody understands it the same way. If you have different values, different ways of communicating, then it's not going to be understood. And the other kid's like, nah, I don't really want to. Not realizing that what they just said was, no, I don't want to play that game with you. Because that's not what they heard. So sometimes those kinds of things can really result in relational conflicts. And sometimes it just needs to be addressed with, hey, I think he wanted to play the game. Pay attention to what's going on. You can probably solve a lot of those problems, just like I said, by having that relationship with them and figuring out that not everybody communicates the same way. I'll give you another example. Values that seem really black and white would be something like stealing. But then you have some families where if it belongs to the family, anybody can use it. And other families where if it belongs to this person, you have to ask before you use it. And those kinds of values are going to not necessarily translate the same way in a setting where there's multiple kids together. So again, keep your eyes open for different ways that the values are different, but they're not obvious right at first. That's something that you can really help keep things positive if you can just say, oh, hey, I think that was his pencil, and I don't think he wants you to use it. Can you let him have it back? Does that make sense? Okay. So that is the first part, the preventing problems and positive environment. And for the recording, we're going to pause here. Do you have any questions before we go on? Questions or comments? Yes? Yeah, if you don't mind. Sorry. Yeah, she can.
Last year, there was a girl that just always wanted to be in my group, and she was just real sweet. And she asked me to come to her concert. She was in orchestra or something. And I said I would, look at my schedule, and I was unable to make it. But I just had a question about outside of that context.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the game club. How involved, can you get with the kids?
I think that's kind of up to you and your, like you said, your schedule. But that's a great way to let them know you care. If you're able to go to say a game if they play sports, or a concert if they play an instrument or something like that. It's a really, really great way to connect with kids and let them know, hey, I'm interested in you and I care. I just went to the Richland County Fair last week because I knew some of my students from last year had animals there. And so I just made a point of going ahead and going and seeing the animals, and I did see some of those kids there because, I went to where their animals were. But outside of it, obviously make it to where you feel comfortable and you have time in your schedule. But if you do, that means a lot to kids. Yes.
But if you do for one, you should do for all, right?
When you can. Kids are pretty aware, especially once they get to upper elementary. They are aware that you also have a schedule and a life and things like that. And yes, you do. I would say you really want to be careful that you're not, going to multiple events for one kid and then ignoring events for others. But also keep in mind, if you don't know about events for other kids, they don't tell you, then you may just not know about it. Feel free to ask, for all of them, any of them. But yes, I think it's fair to say what's equitable is not necessarily you go to the exact same number of events for every single kid. But if you're interested, you ask them how it went. If you know about it and you couldn't make it, that's a great way to connect on something that they invited you to when you can't go. Yeah, follow up.
I just want to add that asking questions that prove that you were listening, so intelligent questions responding to what they said in the moment is huge, but you just hit on, hey, you said you were going to have a game last week. How did that go? I wasn't able to go to the game, but I communicated I cared about it, and that's huge.
Right.
And we
It
can
is.
do that. We can do that for all the kids.
Yep.
Our schedule isn't as much of a factor there, just our ability to remember. So I would even encourage you guys, when you're having interactions with kids, and if they share something with you, think at that moment, man, I should probably mention that later. Write it down.
Yeah. I've actually taken, I've put reminders in my phone that will pop up to remind me about things like that. Hey, ask them about this event. So, yeah, good idea. Okay. Okay. We'll go ahead and start part 2 of the managing behavior session. I have a water bottle in the back if you want to bring it. Sorry. Okay, we'll start part 2 of the managing behavior session. This part is going to be a little more focused on some really practical things that you can do. And usually in response to more negative behaviors, rather than focusing on keeping it positive, this is going to be what do you do when it doesn't go the way you want it to go? Thank you. So I divided this up into 3 parts. One of them is for simple things where they need redirection. People get off track a little bit, or you were doing something that's a little rowdy and it's time to calm back down. Things that you can do just to bring kids back in and get them back to focus. And like I said, this part is going to have some really practical things to do. And hopefully you can pick, you do not have to remember all of them. You can pick 1 or 2 that you're like, oh, I can do that. So the idea is I'm trying to offer you a bunch of options that you can kind of figure out what works for you. So a key part of this, and we hinted at it in the last session, was that behavior is communication. We need to understand what is going on before we're going to really effectively manage behavior. Sometimes the communication is really easy to see. Sometimes you were doing something that everybody got excited and was really into, and they are communicating that they really enjoyed this. Well, if it's time to move on to something else, then you're gonna have to figure out, okay, how can we do that? They're still telling me this was fun, let's move on and how to do that. Okay, so the first part, redirection and refocusing. These are things that you'll do, again, when things get rowdy or the noise level goes up. Some of these are really simple. The first one, if you can hear me. If everybody is talking and busy, then you simply make sure you're close enough to at least one child that they can hear you well. And you start out by saying, if you can hear me, and then you ask for some kind of motion or something that you can see. If you can hear me, raise one hand. This is the one I use a lot. Once that child raises their hand, other kids notice, oh, somebody's raising their hand, I wonder what's going on. And they start focusing and paying attention. So then you go on to the next one. If you can hear me, raise both hands. If you do that, well now, maybe raising one hand's pretty normal, but two hands isn't. And you've got almost everybody's attention at this point, especially if you're talking in a voice that they can hear, which we'll get to the next one shortly. So then you go on. If you can hear me, put both hands on your head. I have about 3 things. Usually by the time I get to the third thing, raise one hand, raise both hands, put your hands on your head, I've got all but like 2 people usually, maybe even everybody, paying attention and doing it. That means that they're listening, they're ready for instructions, and then I usually say, if you can hear me, put your hands on your lap, and please listen to me. Great way to transition into, here I've got something to tell you. That one's simple, it doesn't take any preparation, and it's great to use with the whole group when you just need to get everybody refocused and get their attention. The next one you can use in conjunction with it. Use a quiet voice. You can use it separately. You can just, if you notice kids like in the back are chatting instead of focusing, use a quick change in tone or loudness, pitch of your voice, whatever. Just change just a little bit because that change captures attention. It's super simple. If you suddenly start talking quieter, kids are going to wonder what's going on. It draws attention to what you're doing, what you're saying, and usually if they're not completely off the wall, not paying attention, it gets them right back focused in. If they are all completely off the wall, not focused, paying attention, you're going to need to use something a little bit different to get their attention. But this is a great one for when things just start getting a little less focused and you just want to get them back in. Again, that change is what gets their attention. The next one is call and repeat. This one does take preparation. This is where if you say have a group that you work with, you simply go over with them some kind of team chant. Who are we? We're Reach Madison. What do? We play together. We have fun. Whatever you want to do, but you do that and you practice it. And then what happens if you do it, say when you're transitioning from one thing to the next thing, and that's what you do every time, then sometime when they're a little out of focus, you can simply start the chant and they jump right in because that's what they do. They're accustomed to it, it's fun, and it helps get them focused back in. And then you can just tell them, hey, okay, we're back together, let's go ahead and do this now. Or let's try this again, which is another thing you can do. Let's try again and let's try to be a little quieter, which I'm kind of jumping ahead. Number 4, this again, pick 1 or 2 of these. You don't have to use every single one. If you can, great. But they all have different applications too. This one is super helpful if you've got kids who get worked up, who get upset. Either they're super excited and having fun and they're a little off the wall, or if you've got 2 kids who maybe were playing a game and he cheated, no I didn't, and you're starting to get a little heated and angry. What you usually do, you just have them stop whatever they're doing and do deep breathing. Okay, let's all inhale. 1, 2, 3. Hold it. Exhale. 1, 2, 3. There's a really simple reason why you do this. Here's why. When you get excited or upset, adrenaline kicks in, and it actually shuts down your prefrontal cortex. the part of your brain that thinks things through and is logical, shuts it down and you start reacting. So if you have the kids stop and breathe, what that does is actually reactivates the thinking part of your brain. Then you can actually talk to them about what's going on. You can, hey, okay, how can we handle this better? Or, hey, that wasn't an appropriate way to handle this. What's the rule? Let's go ahead and do this better this time. The important thing is you do need to catch them before they are all the way into flight or fight, because if you're in the middle of a fight, you're really going to have a hard time getting them to stop and breathe because they're reacting really totally from the reactionary part of themselves. So if you notice things are starting to ramp up and they're starting to get excited, that's a good time to say, okay, I think it's time for a stop and breathe. You can use this with 1 or 2 students. You can use it with the whole group. It's good for any of those. Also, this one doesn't take preparation. You just have to make sure you got their attention and have them do it. So that's a big reason to keep that one in mind is just if you get into a situation like that, that helps everybody re-engage that thinking brain and think more logically. So that was for just minor redirection, things that are not major problems. If we get into where there's actually misbehavior happening, not just distraction, that last one is actually a good one for this too. But when you get into minor issues where there are 1 or 2 students who are maybe not doing what they're supposed to do, and they're actually going and doing things they shouldn't do rather than just not doing what they should do. One of them is identify somebody who is doing the right thing and praise that behavior. This is really helpful because it identifies what they should be doing. It's a reminder without calling anyone out or putting them on the spot for not doing it. Hey, I noticed that you're paying attention. Good job. Or, hey, I noticed you've got all your pieces out for that game. I noticed you've got your book open to page 13. Any of those, it tells them what they should be doing, and it gives a positive reward. It gives that positive consequence to kids who are doing what they're supposed to do. It's a great way just to kind of remind kids and review what they're supposed to do. Again, it's reinforcing that positive. It's focusing on what you want them to do. Another one is eye contact and pause. This is when you know they know what to do. Often, you should pair it with a verbal prompt. Everyone should be on page 13. You know this kid was off doing something else and doesn't have his book open, so you simply look at them, make eye contact, pause for a moment. Usually, that kid knows you're looking at them. The other kids know we're waiting for someone. Not a big deal. Everyone should be on page 15, right? And it doesn't necessarily call anyone out, and it gives them a chance to redirect right then and there. If that doesn't work, or instead of that, either one, you can use proximity. I am going to pause just a second. Okay, good. The slides are readable. If you look at the slides, they kind of give a summary of good times to use it and good things to use it for. I'm probably not going to go over that because you can read those on your own, but you'll catch some of that just from what I'm saying, just to kind of connect those with what's on the screen. Proximity is where you get close to them. I would happily, try it here, but since I'm recording, I'm supposed to stay up here. But a really simple one to do is if they're not one kid, especially when it's one kid, or there's 2 kids interacting here and they're not supposed to be talking right now, or they're maybe not doing what they're supposed to be doing, just walk over by them. Continue doing what you're doing. Continue being the leader, giving instruction, monitoring, but make sure that you're close to those kids who are not on track. For some reason, you guys probably remember this from being kids too, but for some reason, when there's an adult nearby, it's a lot easier to do the right thing than when you're not sure they're paying attention to you. Again, it's that closeness. It reminds them what they're supposed to be doing. It holds them accountable a little bit. For whatever reason, it also doesn't embarrass them directly. You're just moving around the room. And it's especially great if, when they get back on track, go ahead and move on. You can check back in occasionally and make sure they're still on track. But this is going to work when you're able to move around. If you're in the middle of playing a game with them, you may not be able to do that as well. But if the kids are playing and you're kind of monitoring, it's a great way to kind of keep things on track when you see a little trouble spot. Redirection is the next one. This one is basically, do you know what you're supposed to be doing? And how can you get there? You can also ask, what are you going to do about it if they're not doing it? What I like about this one is, do you know what you're supposed to be doing? Gives them a chance to say, no, I have no idea. Maybe they weren't paying attention. Maybe they weren't here when you gave the instructions. Maybe they have an attention problem, and like one of my kids, he heard it, but he forgot. It gives you a chance to reinforce what's expected. Again, that positive expectation. Okay, you're supposed to be doing this. If they do know, it gives them a chance to say, yeah, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get my pencil out, or I'm going to go ahead and get my game piece and put it on the board, whatever it is that they can do. It gives them a chance to do that. Now, there will be a few times. Usually, if kids can do well, they do. But occasionally, you've got a kid who won't. And that's when we go back to that communication thing. Behavior is communication. Figure out, what are they trying to communicate to you. Another one is try it again. If they're doing something and they did it badly, can you go back and try that again? Usually be specific. Can you try that again, but a little quieter? If they slam the door, hey, can you try closing the door again, this time without slamming? That's a negative focus, though, so maybe can you close the door a little more quietly this time? Something like that. Be specific. You should use it when you can give a direct explanation of what you expect. I like again, if you can focus on the positive, this is what I want you to do. Try it a little quieter, that kind of thing. When you have a kid who simply forgets, like I said, one of my sons is this way. He forgets things all the time. Sometimes you can just have a pre-planned signal. If they continually lose focus, you can just, something like fingers on the, fingers to the board, fingers to your paper. It's a simple pre-planned signal. You tell them, hey, when I notice that you're off track, how about if I do this? If you talk to them ahead of time, they know it's coming. It's a great way to help them refocus. Some kids learn differently. Some kids focus differently, and they need that. And I feel like I'm really running over on time here. The last part is bigger issues. Hopefully you don't have too many of these. But if you do, here's just a couple of things that you can do. The first thing I want to say is, often when you get into bigger issues, you want to document. You want to write it down. You want to communicate it to a leader. You want to make sure that somebody knows this is going on. Because often, again, with that behaviors communication thing, they're communicating something, and someone needs to make sure that they hear it. And if you hear it, that's great. Make sure that you're communicating with somebody else and keeping accountability going. But that's one thing you want to do. When you get into the bigger issues, make sure that communication is happening, that it's documenting, that it's being told to someone, written down, whatever. I already said, consider what they're communicating. You want to do this all the time. Anytime that you have an issue come up that you need to address, what are they communicating? Marcus is falling asleep every day. Maybe he's communicating things are not good at home, and he could really use an advocate for him at school and home. That's kind of a big deal, and it might be a little beyond the extent of Reach Madison, but it might be something that you can find a resource for him. Even just being heard is really helpful for kids in those situations. Relationship helps you figure that out. Then the try it again works okay for this too. You get a bigger issue, somebody gets angry, slams the door, walks out. Pull them aside. This is actually let me see. Yeah, this is the fourth one on this. So don't worry about jumping ahead. I'll go back. I'll get to it. But if you pull them aside and have a conversation, and then say at the end, "Hey, let's try this again. This time with quietly and calmly going back to the game," and give them a chance. It's the same thing as before, but maybe with a bigger issue. And you may want to document that this happened, depending on, again, with that relationship with the kid. You know who they are and if this needs to be written down and followed up on or not. This one, the third one, time out or time in. They are two variations on the same idea. They have done something that requires you to change the environment so that you can change the behavior. Time out means removal. That's where Sarah kicked somebody, so she needs to take a break from the game until she can be respectful to those playing. Time in is come and sit up here by me so that I can help you focus. Both of those are great ways to change the environment to help change the behavior. Again, if you do these, you probably want to note it, write it down. Even if it's just a note, hey, they work better when they're sitting beside the teacher so that, you remember the next day or the next person. I mentioned pulling aside for a conversation. This one is really helpful. Please avoid things like you always or you never. You may want to use a script. When you did this, then I don't know what to do. Then I can't help you play the game well. You use something like that because it helps keep the focus off of you're a horrible person and on let's address the behavior. Ask them questions. You can get to that. What are they communicating if you ask good questions? Avoid doing this where you are all alone and unobserved with a child. That's not healthy and that's not safe for them or for you. Some kids will feel trapped and angry if they are pulled aside all alone with an adult because of the history that they have. So it should be somewhere where it's observable and still have a private conversation, if that makes sense. Do be careful, just to be careful for your own safety and for the kids' safety. Don't go in a room and close a door and not be observed. You do want to make sure you're still accountable that way. The last two, number 5, when you give them what you expect, then so if you stopped a game because something was happening, they were skipping turns, when you're ready to take turns, then we'll resume the game. It's simple. It gives them a chance to say, I don't know if I can do that today. Okay, then you can go to that timeout. Let's have you take a break from the game and the other kids can go on playing. That way we don't keep everybody. You can use this with the whole group too. When the whole group is getting really loud, you can say, hey, when you quiet down, we'll continue. So you can use this with one kid, you can use it with a large group of kids. It's helpful because you're stating your expectation and then giving them what's the consequence, going right back to that positive preventative. Keep it positive and make sure that they understand the results of their actions. The final one is report up. This is where you've tried stuff, you've given them a chance to correct, and they're just not correcting. That's when you say, hey, this is beyond me and my ability, and you tell whoever is a higher authority figure in this situation. Usually, you should use it when they've had a chance to do a self-correction. There is one exception I will say, and that is when there is safety at stake. If there is a situation that's not safe, do it immediately. That's the one exception to give them a chance to self-correct. Safety is really important. Hopefully, in here, you've had some kind of intervention or a strategy that you feel like you can use and kind of keep things on track or get things back on track. Do any of you have questions before I wrap it up? Okay. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Tricia. Yeah, she really did a great job. Did much better than I would. Hey guys, let's take just a few minute break. You need to use the restroom, get something to drink, grab a cookie.